You're listening to Puma Podcast.
Hi, I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News. Balitang thinking, hindi breaking. In this episode,
When I look at these discussions on gender equality, how well we are doing as far as the World Economic Forum is reporting, as far as other studies on gender equality, I am still deeply, deeply disturbed, not so much perhaps by gender equality, but the inequality between and among women ourselves. I always talk about women who have it all and women who have nothing at all.
Filipino diplomats talk about closing the gender gap, both here at home and abroad.
Let me now share with you what I believe is the most important and relevant contribution of Filipino women diplomats to the women of the world.
That's Delia Albert, former Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the Philippines, the only woman so far to have held the post. She was speaking at an event organized last week by Asia Society.
I refer to the work of the late Ambassador Leticia Ramos Shahani, who was recognized in an obituary in March 2018 by the New York Times as a, quote, pioneer in the international women's movement at a time when few women had a place in statecraft, end of quote.
Shahani was a career diplomat who went on to become a two-term senator and writer. She was also President Fidel Ramos's sister.
The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, which is familiar to us and known as CEDAW, was drafted in the Department of Foreign Affairs Office of United Nations and other international organizations under the direction of Ambassador Shahani. The draft was then presented to the Commission on the Status of Women in Geneva while she was rapporteur of the Commission in 1973.
Getting to that point was not easy. Ambassador Shahani's document, at first, had very little support. She was forced to reach behind the Iron Curtain and work with Russian delegate Tatyana Nikoleva, who was the only willing co-sponsor. The move went against strict instructions not to engage with communist diplomats and was swiftly reprimanded by Shahani's boss, Foreign Secretary Carlos P. Romulo.
In the following years, Ambassador Shahani assiduously followed the debate on the draft convention, which went through rigid scrutiny in the United Nations system. It took several years to discuss and review the substance, as well as the necessary stylistic and technical changes before the draft was formally adopted by consensus in December 1979 and finally executed in July of 1980. The Philippines is the first country in Asia to ratify the convention.
But what makes the CEDAW so important?
The Philippines, like most countries, recognizes the CEDAW as a document from a female perspective which defines inequality on women's terms without a male default. It acknowledges genuine biological differences, but also prohibits socially constructed gender stereotypes. Moreover, we celebrate CEDAW for its contribution to global development, theory, and practice.
In short, the CEDAW is recognized as an international Bill of Rights for women.
A personal footnote. I waited till the convention was ratified before I could get married. Because before my time, no Filipino woman diplomat was allowed to marry a foreign man. But the men were allowed to marry anyone they wished. So you see what a convention can do. It can make the impossible possible.
But for all of the Philippines' contributions, the treaty itself has demonstrated where we continue to fall short. It was through the Sadao that the Malaya Lolas, World War II survivors of sexual slavery perpetrated by the Imperial Japanese Army, sought redress at the United Nations. The victims claimed that the Philippines breached its obligations under the convention, and the UN agreed. The UN Women's Rights Committee also ruled that the Philippines violated these victims' rights by failing to provide them with adequate reparation, social support, and recognition. The latest UN decision is just one example of how much work there is to be done to uphold women's rights. When we return, we ask, how can we improve? The World Economic Forum, in its latest Global Gender Gap Index, ranked the Philippines 19th out of 156 countries. While relatively high, it was 2 spots lower than where we were the year before, and the lowest we've ranked since the index was first launched in 2006. In the Department of Foreign Affairs, women outnumber men 60 to 40, an impressive statistic to be sure. But here's some additional context from Secretary Albert herself.
While we revel at the number and quality, of course, of our Filipino women diplomats, data tells us that male ambassadors still dominate in numbers. From the time when our Foreign Service was created to the present, male ambassadors comprise 74.9%, 75, give and take, while women ambassadors from 1958 to the present, we comprise 24.9% or 25%. So it's 75 to 25.
So how do we bridge this gap? Here's Sweden's ambassador to the Philippines, Annika Thunberg.
Sweden ranks highly when it comes to gender equality, and together with the other Nordic countries, I think we're 4 of the Nordic countries, we are among the 5 countries in the world that have achieved the highest level of gender equality according to a vast number of reports and UN statistics.
She says her country's success at advancing women's rights was tied to another key policy.
Also this, that I think it also had to do with that we actually had eradicated poverty in the 1970s in Sweden. So where the focus had been for decades to eradicate poverty and achieve social equality, then the next step was to move to gender equality. So again, my generation benefited from that. There were a number of reforms that were put in place in the 70s and 80s, and they were focused on women's economic empowerment. For example, separation of taxation. Before that, you had taxed the family as one unit, but the idea of taxing the income tax was separated within a couple, which meant that there were more incentives for the woman to actually work. And you also had parental leave, which was shared, equal for men and women.
You heard that right. Equal parental leave. In the Philippines, married men are entitled to 7 days of paid leave for their first 4 children. That's a far cry from the 105 days of paid leave that women receive.
My male colleagues in the Swedish Foreign Ministry, my fellow ambassadors, I don't believe that there is a single one of them who has not been home with each of their children at least 6 months for each child, while their wives have been working. And that made it possible for women to really focus on their careers. Because before that, of course, they had been focused on both the family and on the work, and it was difficult to break the glass ceiling because they had too much to do. But because men took a much greater role in raising the children, in taking care of the house and the family, women were free to also pursue their professional careers. So I always say that, this was the most important change in Sweden.
The Philippines and the Vatican remain the only countries in the world that ban divorce. Ambassador Thunberg says that's holding women back as well.
And I know that these issues are a little bit controversial here, but it was very important in my country. The legislation, the right to divorce in 1974, the right to abortion also in 1974. This was important in terms of moving the agenda on these issues forward.
At the top of this episode, you heard Secretary Albert mention another form of inequality, the one between women who have it all and women who have nothing at all.
I still feel very strongly that the gap remains in our society in terms of perhaps not the horizontal, but what I call the vertical inequality. That is, to me, the biggest challenge that we, not only as diplomats, but as women in this country, should be attending to.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. This episode was edited by Pidoy Blanco. If you like this episode, share it with a friend or two. And don't forget to follow Teka Teka News and Puma Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. At para sa mga mahilig manood sa YouTube, Puma Podcast na rin po kami doon. Just search Puma Podcast and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for listening.